It has been said that in the end of all things, we would find a new beginning. But as the shadow once again crawls across our world and the stench of terror drifts on a bitter wind, the people pray for strength and guidance. They should pray for the mercy of a swift death, for I have seen what the darkness hides. You know the story, that's why you're here. The trials, the accusations, the gallows on Gallows Hill. But before the fear, before the whispers of witchcraft, before the villagers turned on each other, Salem was only a small settlement at the edge of a vast and unforgiving wilderness, a frontier village pressed between dark forests and the cold Atlantic Sea, a place where winter lingered and the nights were silent, where the world beyond the trees was still unknown. In such places, the line between the natural and the unnatural grows thin. And sometimes, something crosses it. It was in 1691, during what had been the longest and harshest winter Salem had seen in decades. The snow lay heavy upon the fields, and the forests stood silent beneath the cold, damp air. The sea itself seemed distant and hostile. Smoke rose thinly from the chimneys of the village, and the nights stretched long and dark. In such winters, the world felt smaller, and fear was close at hand, ready to grow, waiting. It began quietly, in an unassuming home, the home of a minister at that. Reverend Samuel Parris had arrived in Salem Village only a few years earlier. He was severe and single-minded. He maintained a strict household, and his sermons were heavy with warnings of sin and corruption. Those who attended often left with the uneasy sense that the forces of darkness were always lurking around, too close for comfort. With him lived his wife Elizabeth, his daughters Betty and Susanna, his son Thomas, and his niece Abigail, along with two enslaved servants, Tituba and John Indian. It was during this particularly cruel winter that the girls Betty and her cousin Abigail began to behave strangely. What seemed childish nonsense at first, fits of laughter, whispers behind closed doors. Small annoyances that could have been dismissed as imagination grew into a more troubling and erratic behavior. The girls would scream suddenly and without warning. They twisted into violent contortions and claimed to be pinched by invisible hands. Their cries echoed in the household at night, cries that no prayer could appease. A physician was summoned to tend to them, but after an exhaustive examination he could find no illness. There was no fever, no cold or injury, nothing that might explain the strange affliction overtaking the girls. And so in deeply puritanical fashion, he reached for the explanation that made the most terrible sense to the people in Salem, one that would write the name of the village in history forever. Once the word was spoken, it spread like a cold winter through an open door. Witchcraft. In the deeply religious atmosphere of puritanical New England, the devil was ever present in the daily lives of its people. He moved quietly through the world, seeking to corrupt the faithful through deception and manipulation. If the girls were suffering from invisible torment, It could only mean one thing. Someone in Salem was having dealings with the dark. Once the villagers realized this, the pressure on the girls intensified. Neighbors questioned them relentlessly, and ministers prayed over them. The people of Salem demanded to know who or what had done this to them. But the girls could offer no clear answer, at least not at first. Their fits continued. Their screams filled the house. The mystery deepened. Then something shifted. And as time passed, they began to speak. They claimed to see dark figures in the night, figures that others could not see, shadowy shapes moving through the house, faces appearing beside their beds, spirits whispering in their ears. And slowly, they began to press blame onto those around them. They first turned to Tituba, their household slave, who had once taught the girls a strange fortune-telling game known as the Venus glass, a practice in which egg white was dropped into a glass of water to glimpse shapes said to reveal the future. The following accusations pointed to individuals already viewed with suspicion in the village, people who lived at the fringes of the community, whose reputations made them easy to blame for what was happening. But the girls' stories did not stop with a couple of names. Each episode seemed to add to the list of culprits. Each vision brought a different accusation. To the adults around them, these revelations were indisputable evidence. The invisible enemy they had feared for so long was finally being revealed. Yet, even in those early days, the events surrounding the girls followed strange and shifting patterns. There were moments where the house felt quiet, moments when the girls seemed almost themselves again. Their voices softened, their bodies stilled. But the calm never lasted long. When ministers arrived to question them, when neighbors gathered close, whispering prayers and fearful suspicions, the fits returned. The girls stiffened, their bodies twisted violently. Their voices rose into shrieks that echoed through the narrow wooden halls of the house. Invisible hands seemed to torment them. They cried out at figures, people who were not there. And the more the village watched, the more terrible the afflictions became. The air around the household grew heavy with dread. Word of the strange ailment spread beyond the walls of the home and into the streets of Salem. Neighbors spoke of unseen forces moving quietly through the village, of spirits wandering in the dark hours of the night. Something had awoken in Salem, something that stirs when accusations are believed without question. The village searched desperately for an answer. Ministers prayed over the afflicted. Families whispered of curses and dark bargains. The scriptures were read out loud again and again in the hope that the torment might be driven away. But the darkness only deepened. Soon it was no longer just the girls trembling. Fear began to spread like a disease. And once fear takes hold in a place like Salem, dark things will follow. The girls suffering under claims of unseen attackers provided the tinder that ignited everything. Under intense questioning, Tituba described the devil visiting her. She spoke of dark figures who approached in the night. She claimed to have seen a book in which witches signed their name to pledge loyalty to evil. But her claims did not end there. She said she had not been acting alone. There were others, many others. From that moment forward, Salem was no longer dealing with a single witch. It was confronting the likelihood that a whole coven had been living among them for years. Neighbors watched one another with new suspicion. Ordinary disagreements took on darker meanings. Small grudges that had once been ignored began to resurface in the form of accusations, and the afflicted girls continued to scream. Life in the village suddenly stopped. Everything revolved around the accusations. In the following weeks, several arrests were made. It began with a few people in the margins of society, people who were already viewed with suspicion or distrust. Individuals whose lives did not easily fit between the rigid expectations of Puritan New England. Inside the courtroom, Betty and Abigail continued their strange displays. When the accused entered the chamber, the girls would sometimes collapse to the floor in violent convulsions. They twisted their bodies into unnatural shapes, screamed that invisible hands were choking them, and cried out that the accused was attacking them spiritually. They recoiled from things no one else could see, and the court took them at their word. The magistrates began accepting something that would become one of the most controversial features of the trials: spectral evidence. The idea behind it was simple, though its implications were dangerous. If the spirit of a person appeared in a vision and caused harm, it was assumed that the devil was involved, for he cannot take the form of another without their permission. And so it was that if someone had claimed to see your spirit, it was taken as proof that you had dealings with the profane. And once such evidence was taken seriously, it spread through the village like a plague. The accusations multiplied. Each new testimony seemed to reveal another hidden layer of corruption within the village. The afflicted girls claimed that entire gatherings of witches were meeting in secret. They spoke of dark ceremonies and whispered conspiracies. Some people even said they had seen the devil himself lurking in the shadows at night. A single accusation from anyone was enough to summon the authorities. Once a name entered the court records, it carried a terrible momentum. More arrests were made until they were in the hundreds. The jail in Salem quickly filled beyond its capacity. Prisoners were transferred to nearby towns, shackled in cold cells as they waited their trials. Even some formerly respected members of the community were captured. Now they waited in darkness, uncertain whether they would ever see the light of day again. What had begun with the people deemed pariahs of the village had now crept into the community. Church members, farmers, respected families whose names had long carried influence in Salem. The line separating accuser and accused blurred into a complete chaos. There were moments during the trials when the courtroom itself seemed to transform into a stage of invisible conflict. The afflicted girls would sometimes mimic the movements of the accused. Sometimes if someone raised a hand, the girls screamed as though struck by an unseen blow. The girls recoiled in terror. To the magistrates observing these scenes, the meaning seemed clear. The devil had found his instruments, and they were standing before the court. For the accused, defending themselves was nearly impossible. How could one prove that their spirit had not appeared somewhere in a dream? How could anyone disprove a vision that only the accuser claimed to see? Logic struggled to survive in a place where invisible forces were treated as physical evidence. Each conviction deepened the belief that witches had been hiding in Salem for years, hiding in plain sight. Yet beneath the growing certainty, something else was quietly unfolding. The machinery of accusation had begun to move faster than anyone could control. Names continued to appear. Neighbors turned on one another. Children began to name the guilty. Those who had once supported the trials began to wonder how far this madness might reach, for the logic that sustained the trials carried within it a terrible possibility. If the devil truly walked in the village, he could choose anyone. And if anyone could be a witch, no one in Salem was beyond suspicion. In June of 1692, the first execution took place. The town had already spent months listening to accusations, confessions, and testimonies about invisible spirits that supposedly moved through the village at night. By the time the first trial reached its conclusion, many people in Salem were already convinced that the devil had established a foothold among them. The first to be condemned was Bridget Bishop. She was not the sort of woman Puritan New England found comfortable. She dressed more colorfully than most, argued openly with neighbors, and had long been the subject of gossip. In another place, these things might have been dismissed as nothing more than personality. In Salem, this became evidence. Witnesses claimed strange things about her home. They spoke of mysterious figures appearing in the orchard at night. Others swore they had seen spectral visions of Bishop, tormenting them in their sleep. The court listened carefully. The verdict came quickly. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was taken to Gallows Hill. The crowd gathered quietly as the sentence was carried out. When the rope tightened and the body fell still, something changed in Salem. The line between accusation and death had been crossed. And once crossed, it proved remarkably easy to cross again and again. Over the following weeks, the trials accelerated. More people were brought before the court. The afflicted girls continued their performance in the courtroom, collapsing into fits, screaming at invisible figures pointing toward the accused, as though something only they could see hovered nearby. Each display reinforced the court's belief that the devil was present in Salem. One by one, the condemned were taken to the gallows. Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, John Proctor, Martha Carrier. By the end of the summer, 19 people had been executed. But among all of the stories that emerged from the Salem trials, one remains particularly strange. It involved a man named Giles Corey. Corey was an elderly farmer, over 80 years old, known for his stubborn nature. When he was accused of witchcraft, he was brought before the court like many others. But when the time came for him to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, Corey refused. He said nothing. This created a problem for the authorities. Under English law, a trial could not proceed unless the accused entered a plea. Without one, the court had no formal way to continue the process. But Salem was not inclined to allow the matter to simply remain unresolved. Instead, the magistrates turned to a brutal legal practice known as peine forte et dure, a method intended to force a defendant to speak. Corey was taken to an open field. There, he was laid flat upon the ground. A wooden board was placed across his chest. Then stones were brought and stacked slowly on top of the board. The weight would increase until the man either entered a plea or died beneath it. At first the stones were manageable. Corey remained silent. More stones were added. Witnesses later described the slow progression of the ordeal. The weight grew heavier with each stone placed upon his chest. Breathing became more difficult. The pressure pushed down on his lungs, forcing the air from his body. Still, Corey refused to speak. The sheriff asked him again for a plea. Again, silence. Another stone was placed on the board. Famously, after a long time bearing the weight, when the officials demanded that he plead his case, Corey finally spoke. Defiantly, he simply said, "More weight." The words were repeated as the stones continued to pile higher. More weight. The ordeal lasted hours. By the time the stones were removed, Giles Corey was dead. By refusing to participate in the trial, he prevented the court from legally confiscating his land. His family would inherit it. In death, he denied the court one final victory. The executions continued even after Corey's death, yet the growing number of deaths was beginning to worry some within the colony. The accusations showed no sign of stopping. The list of suspects continued to expand. Salem had become a place where suspicion alone could lead to the gallows, and the trials were far from finished. Yet beneath the growing certainty of the court, something else was brewing. The accusations were reaching people of influence, respected families, church members, even relatives of those who had once supported the trials. The hysteria had become so powerful that it no longer distinguished between the guilty and the untouchable. At last, the governor of Massachusetts intervened. Governor William Phips ordered the court to stop accepting spectral evidence. Without those visions and invisible attacks, the prosecutions quickly began to collapse. The special court that had overseen the trials was dissolved. Prisoners were released. The executions ended as abruptly as they began. When the trials finally ended, the noise that had filled Salem for months seemed to vanish almost overnight. The accusations stopped. Life resumed. The gallows on the hill stood unused. But the quiet that followed was not peace. 20 people had died. 19 had been hanged before the watching crowd. One man had been crushed beneath the stones rather than speak. The prison slowly emptied as those who remained alive were released. Some returned to homes that had been abandoned for months. Others came back to farms that had fallen into neglect, fields left untended, while their owners waited in chains. But Salem was no longer the same village it had been before the trials began. Neighbors who had once prayed together now avoided each other in the streets. Families carried memories that would not be spoken aloud again. Some of those who had served as judges later admitted that the court had made grave mistakes. Years later, the colony would formally acknowledge that some innocent people had died. In time, financial compensation was offered to a number of the families who had lost relatives during the trials. But money could not restore what had been taken. The dead did not return, and the memory of the accusations remained. For Salem had learned something terrible about the power of fear. For months, a small village had watched its neighbors led to the gallows because a frightened community had convinced itself that evil was already living among them. The forests surrounding the town still stood. The sea remained distant and hostile. The houses stood as silent witnesses to what had taken place. The name of Salem would be forever written in the dark history of the colonies. And so the shadow would never leave. Because once a community learns how easily suspicion can become certainty, it never truly forgets.